Kelly, and I'm the president of the Friends of Lynn Woods. I want to thank you all for taking the time out of your schedules to come tonight and show your support for this landmark effort to permanently protect our park. Tonight's meeting will feature 3 speakers and a film about the origin and evolution of the woods. The first to speak will be Steve Babbitt, chairman of the Park Commission, a founding member of the Friends of Lynn Woods, and past president of the Friends of Lynn Woods. Steve?
Thank you, Jane. My first recollection of Lynn Woods was back in the 80s, running through there and coming across hulks of cars, and one was smoldering one time, and I said, who runs this place? Later on, when I worked for Verizon, I was sitting there in 1989, and there was an article in the paper about all this master planning process for Lynn Woods. They were talking about selling off parts of the woods to finance other things. They talked about possibility of a second golf course. There was a whole range of things, and again, I said, what's going on? So I saw there was a public hearing at the Heritage State Park Visitor Center, and I went down there and I hooked up with a few people, and that's how we started the Friends of Lynn Woods. I have to say that a conservation restriction in my mind is good for Lynn Woods for a number of reasons. Puts a blanket of protection over there. It's going to define the uses. It's something that is needed. We had an opportunity for this back in 2001. As you drive up Walnut Street, and you look across Birch Pond and you see the land out back there, everybody always thinks it's a piece of Lynn Woods. Well, it wasn't too long ago. It was under the threat of development. And there was a parcel was going to be developed, and pretty soon you would have been looking at houses across the lake. And people like Jim Camo from the DCR and Bob O'Connor got involved, and they had an agreement. We brought it through all the commissions. We had the agreement of the mayor to move ahead, and for some reason things fell apart. So to me, we have a great opportunity to do this again. And I'll tell you, some of the reasons why, and in general, without any great detail, but, there's a couple of landlocked parcels up on Route 1 in Linfield, and these have been a problem since the early 80s when easements were granted to get in there. And it keeps on rearing its ugly head, and, there's been a lot of things. There's been potential land swaps. There's been in recent elections, there's been candidates who have talked about selling parts of it to fund other things in the city. There's been talk of a high school at one time, and there's always that potential. Whenever something comes up where people need space or need land, they look to the woods first, and it's been a battle that the Friends have fought for a long time. There's even a road up there on Mary Ellen Drive, which is the first part going in, is totally on Lynn Woods. It's just totally on Lynn Woods. So with that, I would like to say that I believe that Lynn Woods is Lynn's legacy and must be forever protected. 15 years from now, people will be thankful and appreciative of the wisdom and foresight of those who undertook and pushed the adoption of the conservation restriction protecting the whole resource. I urge you to get behind these efforts, and I believe that Cyrus Tracy and the trustees of the Free Public Forest would be proud of us. Thank you. Now we're going to see a short movie. It's an edited version of So Near the Metropolis.
Here we find nature to be the circumstance which dwarfs every other circumstance, and judges like a god all men that come to her.
Miles north of Boston, Massachusetts, is the industrialized city of Lynn. Within the boundaries of this urban community lies a 2,200-acre forest, which has served as an important source for municipal water and as a community recreation area for more than a century. Today, in spite of the continued pressure to develop open space, This woodland reservation, known as Lynn Woods, remains the second largest municipally owned park in the country.
Before European settlement, the land was used as a hunting ground for the Pawtucket Indians, who dwelt along the coast and up the major river corridors around Lynn, Saugus, and Marblehead. Their leader was a powerful sachem called Mantuampate, and the entire area from Lynn to Marblehead was their domain. In 1629, their life of hunting, fishing, and cultivation was changed forever by the arrival of English settlers from nearby Salem. Unlike the more turbulent relations in other areas of the colony, the Pawtuckets and the settlers of Lynn dwelt in relative peace, but the natives slowly lost ground to disease and to the ruthlessly acquisitive nature of the English immigrants. 200 years later, Lynn poet and historian Alonzo Lewis wrote of the Pawtuckets,
"They were subdued, and the few who were not either killed or made prisoners sought refuge in the darker recesses of their native woods. The ocean in which they had so often bathed, and the streams which had yielded their bountiful supplies of fish, were abandoned in silent grief, and the free and fearless Indian, who once wandered in all the pride of unsubdued nature over our fields and among our forests, was driven from his home, and compelled to look with regret to the shores of the sea and the pleasant abodes of his youth."
Upon the arrival of white men, Lynn Woods began to be utilized during fuel. The land was held in common for the use of the entire community and was frequently referred to as Lynn Commons or the Great Woods. Timber for building was an important early product harvested from the woods, and shortly after their arrival, the settlers began clearing cart paths in the forest to accommodate the cutting and gathering of wood. The earliest man-made structure recorded is a stone bridge built over one of the woodland streams in the 17th century. The bridge became known as the Penny Bridge, and the stream as Penny Brook, for in order to finance its building, each person who used this convenient access was charged 1 penny until it was paid for.
Agitation for the division of all common lands began in 1693, but it was not until 1706 that the decision was affirmed. On April 15th, the town meeting voted
that all ye undivided common lands in ye town, except the training field and the several highways, shall be divided to and among all ye proprietors and inhabitants that have lived in the town of their own fee.
Thus the common land became divided and individually held. Today, pasture walls still lace the woods, ancient evidence of this partitioning. Throughout the 17th and most of the 18th centuries, Lynn remained a sleepy farming village. Although possessing a long ocean front, the town never became a major seaport as did her neighbors Salem and Marblehead, for the Lynn Harbor was too shallow. Nor did farming expand into a major economic force, for the hilly, rocky terrain and the great expanse of brackish marshland made large-scale agriculture impractical.
Beginning in the middle of the 18th century, small-scale shoemaking was practiced in Lynn by individuals in their homes. With the passage of time, shoe manufacturing mushroomed into a huge industry. Eventually, Lynn became the major shoe manufacturing city in the world. The population influx which occurred to meet such industrial demands swamped the once small, homogeneous community and dramatically changed the fabric of life in Lynn. The result of this vigorous industrial growth was that the city grew at a rapid rate and open space shrank correspondingly. During the 18th and early 19th centuries, the Lynn Woods continued to be used as it had always been, as a source of fuel. It wasn't until the 1850s that the forest ceased to be viewed strictly as land to be used for utilitarian purposes. Certain Lynn residents began to see the importance of open space and the necessity of providing recreational areas for all of the Lynn residents, from office personnel to the growing number of immigrant factory workers who were swelling the ranks of the population. There were also a growing number of people who came to appreciate the forest for its sylvan beauty. Chief among those enthusiasts was a self-educated botanist by the name of Cyrus Mason Tracy. Tracy, a Lynn resident from his early youth, roamed the wooded area of Essex County and recorded specimens of botany and geology that he observed in his travels. In 1850, He founded the Exploring Circle with 4 other men. Frequent field trips were made to the woods to gather information for presentations, for members were required to present monthly papers and reports to the circle. The group also made it part of their job to explore and record areas of Lynn Woods previously unknown to most residents. Tracy endeavored to popularize the forest tract, first among naturalists and then to a larger audience. He described it in glowing terms, writing that a district so near the metropolis might contain some things worth looking for. This crystal clear insight of Tracy's, that such a vast area of open space lay so near the metropolis, is a crucially important concept, as much today as it was in those times. Beginning in the 1880s, he organized camp days in the woods for the citizens of Lynn and surrounding communities. Celebrations which included elaborate rituals, speeches, poems, and song. But Lynn Woods was not destined to be simply a forest reservation. The fire of 1869, which destroyed a major portion of the factory district of the city, pointed out the need for an adequate water supply for fire control. The growing population of Lynn also required additional sources of pure drinking water. The Lynn Water Board was established in 1870 and initiated the purchase of Breed's Pond as a city reservoir. By 1872, a comprehensive plan for a municipal water supply was developed. This plan included the acquisition of additional ponds and the creation of new reservoirs in the woods and surrounding area. The Hawks, Penny, Birch, and Beaver brooks which ran through the forest provided the required sources, and large areas suitable for the creation of storage basins made the Lynn Woods a natural location. New roads were cut through the forest, which allowed increased access to areas formerly protected by their remoteness. Cyrus Tracy was the first to understand the threat these activities represented to the woods. Tracy considered the forest to be what he called the ancient legitimate inheritance of the people of Lynn, and he set about establishing an organization which would ensure the Lynn Woods be kept free and open in perpetuity. A group, spearheaded by Tracy, quickly formed within the Exploring Circle. They incorporated as the trustees of the Free Public Forest, and the indenture of trust, which was signed on the 6th of December, 1881, was unquestionably among the most important early efforts to provide permanent recreational space in America.
By that instrument, 7 Lynn citizens voluntarily assumed the care and management of all the woodlands conveyed to them for that purpose, those lands to be dedicated to the free use not only of Lynn residents, but of the surrounding communities as well.
The trustees significantly advanced the acquisition and preservation of the Lynn Woods from 1881 until they turned their responsibilities over to the newly created Park Commission in 1890. Ironically, the incursions by the Water Board, which had so threatened the forest, became a compelling argument for its preservation, for as well as serving as a recreational space, Lynn Woods provided a protective necklace for the city's water supply. Today, with the addition of a state-of-the-art purification plant, the water quality and watershed have become a shining example of the need for protection and preservation of Lynn's dwindling natural resources. Lynn resident Philip Chase served as the first chairman of the Park Commission, proving to be an unstinting Lynn Woods advocate. Chase used his position of prominence in the community to influence people for the public good, initially by championing the cause of forest preservation, and then by tirelessly encouraging donations of land and money. One of the first actions of the Commission was to hire Isaac K. Harris to survey the existing configuration of the woods, including delineating the earlier division of the common lands. Chase wrote to America's most eminent landscape architect, Frederick Law Olmsted, seeking his advice about how best to superintend the Lynn forest. Olmsted wrote the Commission, strongly urging them to leave the site essentially unaltered. He felt that Lynn Woods represented a rare opportunity to preserve what he called a real forest, rather than fruitlessly endeavoring to create an artificially landscaped park. Olmsted wrote,
"The most striking circumstance of your property is that although nearby populous and flourishing communities, much of it is in a state of undisturbed nature, and as a whole it is in a singularly wild, rugged, and rude condition. Its value as a roving ground, not for Lynn and the northern suburbs only, but for the people of Boston in the future, cannot well be overestimated.
According to Olmsted, the task of the Park Commission was not merely to contribute to the variety and beauty of the woods through careful management and selective planting, but also to retain and foster the existing qualities of the natural site. The Park Commissioners took their responsibility to the woods seriously, and the members assumed a long view of the process of preservation. Their foresight and wisdom is reflected in a statement from their 1890 report.
Whatever this city can do for the preservation of the forests, it is bound to do, not for the enjoyment of the living only, but for the generations that succeed us. These forest places for air and exercise, which can be provided today at such a trifling cost, will be of inestimable value to the large population which will seek relaxation and rest in Lynn Woods.
The Woods Reservation was an enormous success from the very beginning. In a time before the automobile, a trip to the Lynn Woods by horse and carriage, or by the trolley which had been routed to the Great Woods entrance, was an exciting weekend excursion. Dungeon Rock served as a major focus of interest, and fire observation towers offered glimpses of life beyond the boundaries of the city, infrequently seen by many Lynn residents of that time. Over the years, Lynn Woods supported several rustic camps in the more secluded sections of the forest. The Park Commissioner's major adversaries in the process outlined by Olmsted were forest fires, insect infestations, and tree blights. Historical record clearly establishes that different areas of Lynn Woods burned repeatedly during its history. In some years, as many as 30 fires raged in the forest, and the Park Commission budget was often consumed by firefighting needs. In the early 1900s, the gypsy and brown-tail moths reached epidemic proportions. The Park Commission attempted to fight the onslaught by spraying arsenate of lead and by tree banding with tanglefoot. By 1910, the Commission had become responsible for a large number of parks, playgrounds, and other public properties, operating on a fixed budget, which was eventually reduced even as their responsibilities grew. It became increasingly apparent that innovations, and even proper maintenance, would not be possible in Lynn Woods. The Commission published its last annual report that year. For Lynn Woods, the years and seasons pass. The trees and vegetation gradually succumb to old age and the elements. But the terrain and character of the forest has remained essentially unchanged throughout the centuries. The forest is in a continual state of transition. Wildlife abounds. Well over 100 species of birds inhabit or seasonally frequent the woods. A large rodent population supports such predators as hawks, owls, and the red-tailed fox. The scenic views afforded the casual walker or hiker do not approach the scale or grandeur of a Yellowstone or Yosemite, but if one ventures off the well-traveled paths, he will see small vignettes of nature in an undisturbed state.
From the mid-1930s onward, the woods was the object of numerous plans and development schemes. Proposals ranged from takeover by the state or federal government to the rezoning and sale of certain sections for housing development. Public sentiment against such proposals consistently prevailed.
I have read with interest the article in the item about consideration being given to making part of Lynn Woods available for residential building. The city of Lynn has a unique asset in its public park, and although it is true that changing times have resulted in more automobile touring and use of the beach, I hope that nothing will be done to seriously impair the availability of our woods for use by the public. I have a particular personal interest as my father, Philip A. Chase, was chairman of the first board of park commissioners. The citizens who brought about the establishment of our park system, made possible by a legislative act of 1882, did a far-sighted thing which has benefited our community for many years. Changing conditions justify consideration of the future of the woods, but I think we should give careful study to this question before making any change. Very truly yours, Alfred F. Chase.
Although there were no funds available to maintain the reservation and it suffered from the inevitable results of that neglect, it was still a frequented recreational space.
Seasoned Lynn residents of today reminisce about the long excursions into the woods on weekends, and the large number of youths, including Boy Scouts, who hiked and played in the forest. Up until the Second World War, the woods was considered a safe recreation place for the young people of Lynn. It was not until 1971 that the public forest faced a threat that promised to divide and permanently alter its character forever. At that time, then-Governor Francis Sargent proposed routing a major highway, Interstate 95, straight through the center of Lynn Woods. For the first time since the days of the Exploring Circle and the trustees of the Free Public Forest, the citizens of Lynn coalesced as a group around the Lynn Woods to stop this grotesque intrusion. Years passed. Properties along the route outside the reservation were condemned and taken. Yet the fight to keep I-95 out of the woods continued. Gubernatorial candidate Michael Dukakis pledged his support for maintaining the woods intact. In response to community pressure and the threat of the upcoming election, Governor Sargent decided not to proceed with the Lynn Woods corridor. The forest was saved from invasion and division. Once again, however, Lynn Woods immediately sank into its traditionally forgotten status in the city. The conditions in the forest by this time were becoming desperate. The battle to maintain the site, with increasing demands being made on park funds, forced the Parks Department to leave the entire woods at the mercy of vandals and destructive elements from Lynn and surrounding communities. When Massachusetts Proposition 2.5 was voted in 1981, the already meager park budget was slashed. The slender allotment for Lynn Woods disappeared and maintenance was brought to a standstill. Without security, the mounds of trash and stolen or abandoned cars increased dramatically. The forest became a no-man's land. In 1985, Lynn Woods was selected to be included in the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Management's Olmsted Historic Landscape Preservation Program. The announcement created a resurgence of interest and optimism for the ancient forest. The city formed an advisory committee comprised of city officials and private citizens to work with the DEM teams engaged in preparing a series of reports on various aspects of Lynn Woods. These reports culminated in a comprehensive plan for the restoration of the reservation. Landscape architects, with the guidance of the advisory committee, created 4 versions of a master plan ranging from passive recreation to more active, intensive development. Lynn residents who attended the advisory committee hearings became concerned that the more intensive plans made provisions for the addition of a second 18-hole golf course and for the sale of reservation land to finance it. Once again, the citizens of Lynn rose to the occasion. A group of concerned individuals banded together and formed a watchdog organization. The Friends of Lynn Woods was formed and began a public awareness campaign and petition drive. The Friends bear a striking resemblance to the trustees of the Free Public Forest incorporated 100 years earlier. Each group formed in response to a threat of development or inappropriate treatment of the woodland reserve. The members of both groups were motivated by a deep appreciation of nature, bolstered by a strong commitment to preserve this unusually large expanse of open woodland so readily available to urban dwellers.
In January of 1990, an open hearing was held by the City Council in order to ascertain public opinion about the proposed master plans, and then to officially endorse one of the 4 concepts for the reservation.
Lynn residents were actively encouraged to attend. They reminisced about the traditional recreational uses of the woods, and then, echoing Olmsted's advice of nearly a century before, they overwhelmingly confirmed the need to leave the woods in its natural state and encourage passive recreation. Today, Lynn Woods is on the road to recovery. The Friends of Lynn Woods, in cooperation with the City of Lynn, has sponsored numerous cleanups and tree plantings aided by citizen volunteers. Abandoned vehicles and trash have become the exception rather than the rule. Diverse groups from around the city have regularly scheduled events in the woods. Committees have been formed to address woods issues, including the rehabilitation of the Rose Garden.
The story of the creation of this forest reservation and its reservoirs is intimately tied to the emergence of national trends in open space conservation and regional landscape planning. Cyrus Tracy's desire to preserve this ancient, legitimate inheritance of the people of Lynn for posterity, and the early Park Commission's commitment to the large population which will seek relaxation and rest in Lynn Woods, will guide and inspire the current population in conserving this precious preserve forever. In the future, pressure to develop reservation and parkland areas will continue to grow. With public awareness and support, environments such as Lynn Woods can and will remain intact for the generations to succeed us.
Okay, I see a lot of familiar faces out there, so most of you know who I am, but for those who don't, my name's Dan Small. I am the and I am the ranger in the Lynn Woods. I'm going to do a brief PowerPoint presentation just to kind of catch things up. This movie was made in 1993 by Mark McInerney was the director. He's sitting in the audience. He's also one of the founding members of the Friends of Lynn Woods. And just want to catch things up so you know where we are today. One of my favorite quotes about the woods, and anytime I feel like I'm spinning my wheels and wasting my time, I like to go back and look at this. In 1973, George Cole, who was apparently the chairman of the Park Commission, described the woods as a deplorable drinking spot that people were afraid to enter even during daylight. We've come a long way since that point. However, the first time I went to the woods in 1999, I went for a walk down on Birch Pond, and I came around the corner, and this is what I saw. And kind of like Steve mentioned earlier with his moment where he was running down the road, saw a burning car, and was like, what's going on? I was like, why is that in the woods? How did it get there, and why is it still there? I didn't realize there were actually lots of cars in the woods. The real cleanup of the woods began in 1991 with the formation of the Friends of Lynn Woods. They got a lot of the heavy-duty trash out of there. 2000 is when I started working up there, and we still had some pretty impressive piles on our cleanups. We could still get tires and engine blocks and some real trash. Today we've gotten to the point where we're pretty much picking up litter and raking leaves on our cleanups. You can get large debris. This gentleman at the bottom got a bicycle, but really that's about where we are right now. That picture is of the last car leaving Lynn Woods. When the price of scrap metal was way up, I ran into this gentleman in the parking lot, and he asked me if there was any scrap in the woods, and I said, sure. And we spent a day getting it. And on the bottom of that pile, you can see the axle and the engine block. That's the last car leaving the woods. They're all gone. A lot of this work was done just with brute force. This is some guys that had found a transmission and an engine block. They strapped it to some boards, and they carried it up the hill from Walden Pond up to the road so we could get rid of it. I still rely heavily on volunteers. I'm the only employee at the park, but I've gone through about 30 Eagle Scouts. They've proven to be a great resource. This gentleman's project was making signs for the trails. And actually, GE is one of my better sources, too. 6 or 7 times a year, they'll come up, and they'll take on just about any project for me. After the place was cleaned up, we had one big eyesore, the stone tower. This was something that was built by the WPA, 1935 to 1937. Unfortunately, like the woods, it kind of became a monument for the destruction of the place. So the great game apparently was to take rocks to the top, throw them out the windows, and see how fast you could smash up the tower. It was damaged to the point that we had to lock it permanently. No one could use it. And then about 10 years ago, the Richardson family, an incredibly generous move, decided they wanted to make a major donation to the park to fix something, and we chose the stone tower. Following some very successful grant writing by John Moberger at Community Development and way too much fundraising by the Friends of Lynn Woods, we were able to raise enough money to repair the tower. The work took all summer, and at the end of the summer, we were able to have school kids enter the tower again legally. This is something I use every day now when I take school groups up. I can walk them to the intersection of Cook Road and Dungeon Road, send half to the tower with the teacher, send the other half with me to Dungeon Rock, and then we swap. They don't have to wait in line. They get a better time, and nobody waits around. It's really been a wonderful thing. After we cleaned the place up, the wildlife also came back. The first week I worked in the woods, I saw a deer out by Route 1. Nobody would believe me. Now we have probably 60 or 70 deer. We had a lot more before the winter, but that was a tough one. Barred owls showed up 3 or 4 years ago, and now we're seeing these guys. All these pictures are taken in Lynn Woods, by the way. I forgot to mention that. Minks. I took the picture on the left. Minks don't pose. So I actually got a picture off the internet on the right. I suspect that guy's stuffed because they don't sit still ever. He's actually poking around the riprap down by Thistle Street on Breed's Pond. They're fairly common down there. Fox, I took this picture down by Birch Pond. And of course, coyotes. This was given to me by one of the abutters. It was a coyote trying to steal the suet bag from our bird feeding station. He didn't get it. He made a good effort but couldn't get to it. So the wildlife is definitely coming back. And we even now have beavers. That's the latest addition. There's a large beaver pond over in the ox pasture. And this guy is actually in Birch Pond on Walnut Street. He's got a bank hut where he's built into the side of the bank. He's on the far Saugus end of the pond if you want to go look for him. They're not very discreet. He's pretty easy to find because they do quite a bit of beaver work. This is another one of the quotes I really enjoy, that Lynn Woods is like Australia. Everybody knows where it is, but nobody goes there. This is actually from 1960. This is a while back when the woods weren't being used. Anybody that goes to the woods regularly knows that that's not the case. It's pretty heavily used. Even on a nasty day like Monday was, it was humid and hot, there were always 10 cars in the parking lot. Back in 2000, when I started working there on a day like that, there might have been one. I used to tell people nobody comes up here in July. Well, that's not the case anymore. They were up year-round, even with a terrible winter. There's always people in the woods. The runners, it's a good example. Some of them are here, excellent. When they first started holding these events, they told me on a good day they get 25 to 30 people. Now they regularly get 10 times that. So it's a good thing. And finally, Pirate Day, my favorite. A lot of you have volunteered to be pirates, thank you. But anyhow, we started the event to try to introduce new people to the woods, kind of to fool them for going on a mile-long hike in the woods at the best time of year in October. And it turned into a pretty good event. We can expect to have about 1,500 people every year to this event. So we've cleaned the woods. The wildlife came back and people are using it. The problem is it's not protected. And I hear this all the time. This is one of the issues we have that we want to resolve here, that if the city ever tries to sell the woods, all the parcels revert back to the original owners. I also heard a version of this where Lydia Pinkham purchased the land, donated it to the city with the agreement that if anybody ever tries to sell it, it'll go back to her heirs. Those things aren't true. This doesn't exist. What is protecting the woods right now, there's a couple of things. The Park Act, it was an act of the legislature in 1882 that gave municipal cities and towns the ability to create municipal parks, let them sell bonds and put down some rules for how they would administrate them. It let them essentially take people's property. If their property was in an area they wanted to turn into the park, they had a mechanism whereby they could do it. And it does provide some protection. Section 10 says that all lands taken will have to remain a park forever. Well, if that was the case, we might as well leave because we're all set. But unfortunately, there's some problems with this. The land taken by the park commissioners is in the center. This represents it. If you look up here, it says 996 acres. As we know, the Lynn Woods is 2,200 acres. The problem is the Park Act only covers land in Lynn and only land taken under the Park Act. The problem we have is there's quite a bit of land in Saugus and quite a bit of land in Lynnfield that are not covered by the Park Act. Plus, all of Ox Pasture was purchased by the Water Board for watershed protection. That's not covered either. Another problem we have with the Park Act is that it says it has to be protected, it has to be a park, but it doesn't define what a park is. So essentially, you could come in with truckfuls of sand and make a dune buggy track, and that's still a park. A second paper, you did see in the movie, they talked about the indenture of trust. This is kind of a strange document. It was, I'm sure, cutting edge at the time, but it's 130 years old. What it said was that the city promised that they would protect the land forever. It would be free forever for people to use, and they would try to expand the park to what we used to consider to be the Great Woods of Lynn, which would be bounded by Downing Street, which we now call Walnut Street, the Newburyport Turnpike, Route 1, Lynnfield Road, which is now Lynnfield Street, and the Dungeon Pasture Wall, which is about where Thistle Street is today. So that the city was going to protect the land, keep it a free forest, and try to expand the property. The land that the Free Public Forest people actually owned was right between Breed's Pond and Dungeon Rock. It was about 160 acres. They turned this 160 acres over to the city, and the city was going to take care of that, plus try to expand the park at the same time and protect it forever. There's a couple of problems with this. The same thing is it doesn't explain what a park is. There's no definition. It has to be parkland, but it doesn't say what a park is. That's a problem. And secondly, it's kind of a vague document, and frankly, I'm not sure it even applies to the land that the Water Board bought. It might just be involved in the Park Commission land. It creates uncertainty, and some people, as we know, see uncertainty as opportunity, and it leaves us vulnerable. An example of what can happen, this is, Steve alluded to this, this is the Linfield land swap, as we dubbed it. If you look at the map, you're out at Route 1, where it says naked fish, that's now the fat cactus. The red hashed land behind that, Linfield decided that they wanted to expand their commercial tax base, and they were going to trade their already existing conservation land, which is the pink parcels, for that red hashed area, which is part of Lynn Woods right now. The idea is that it would be an even swap. We'd get the pink parcels, they get the hashed red one. They would develop the red one, and we'd have the pink ones to protect our watershed. Well, there's a couple of problems with that. First off, that land was already protected, so you're talking about a net loss of about 40 acres of conservation land. And secondly, this lower piece down, the large one, the pink one, isn't even in our watershed. That's on the backside of the hill, and it drains down toward, I believe, Sluice Pond. This really was a no-win situation for Lynn. The area under the hashed red, Lynn owns that because that's where Hawks Brook comes through. That's the headwaters of Hawks Brook, which is why Lynn bought it back in, I believe, 1907. We would have lost that, so we would essentially have a parking lot on the headwaters of our water supply. Hawks Brook runs under Route 1 into Hawks Pond, and eventually into Walden Pond, so we would be selling the headwaters of our water supply. Not the best idea. This wasn't a win-win, as Linfield presented it. This was a win-lose. Linfield won, Lynn lost. So it was relatively a simple matter, and Mayor Clancy stepped up and said, this is absurd, this is never going to happen, and it died right there. But these are the type of things that do come up from time to time. It seems like about every 5 years somebody hatches some plot to take a piece of the Lynn Woods. One of my favorite quotes, this is from Nathan Hawks. He was an early park advocate, and he described the park as a asylum of inexhaustible pleasures, and frankly, I can't agree more. So anyhow, the next speaker is going to be Vanessa Johnson Hall, and she's going to talk about the conservation restrictions. She's from Greenbelt.
So I'm Vanessa Johnson Hall. I'm the Assistant Director of Land Conservation at Greenbelt. I'm here tonight with my colleagues Chris Lapointe, who's our Director of Land Conservation, and Ed Becker, who's our President. I also want to acknowledge, and somewhere in the audience is Jim Camo, who is a native-born and raised Lynn resident, former Lynn resident now in Salem, who now works for DCR, who is helping us in this effort. So this is a photo of me and my dad. And you're probably wondering, why is she showing us a picture of her and her dad? Well, it's because my dad is the reason that I do the work that I do and that I'm standing before you today. I was lucky enough to be raised by a dad who was a science teacher, and I was also lucky enough to be raised in a house that was a bike ride away from 1,900 acres of protected woodlands called Nickerson Park. My dad's the one who instilled in me a deep love and respect for the natural world. Nickerson's woods, ponds, and trails were the setting for our own personal classroom, as well as some of the best dad-daughter adventures. I love to backpack, and my first camping adventure was with my dad. I was about 3 or 4 years old. Dad hauled a tent, food, backpack, and me to the shore of Little Cliff Pond, where he set up our tent for the night. Unfortunately, I had a little accident, being only 3 or 4 years old, so we had to cut our trip short. But the experience took hold, and I relish this memory and all of the other family adventures my family was able to have because of access to these protected lands in our own backyard. You, of course, also have an extraordinary treasure in your own backyard, as we just heard about. Greenbelt has been asked to help the city ensure that the entirety of what you know as Lynn Woods, all 2,200 acres, remain available for you, your family, and future generations to enjoy as you do now forever. So what is Greenbelt, and how can we help you accomplish this? So Greenbelt is a not-for-profit, member-supported land conservation organization that works throughout Essex County. We've been in Essex County now for over 50 years. In that time, we've preserved over 16,000 acres, working with landowners, including municipalities, individuals, families, to conserve farmland and wildlife habitat and scenic landscapes, and providing places for families and communities to enjoy the outdoors. So how do we do this? We preserve land primarily in 2 ways. The first is by owning land. Greenbelt owns and manages a little over 5,700 acres of land in about 300 or so properties that are free and open to the public, like Lynn Woods. for hiking and picnicking and running and dog walking and painting and horseback riding and our own trail races as well and others, summer camps, and other passive recreational uses. The second way is the topic of tonight's meeting, which is through conservation restrictions. Greenbelt currently holds over 6,500 acres of privately owned lands in conservation restrictions, a little over 210 properties. And so what is a conservation restriction? A conservation restriction is a legal document, a legal agreement between a landowner and a nonprofit land trust, or sometimes a state or federal conservation agency. A conservation restriction permanently restricts the amount and type of development that can occur on that land. A conservation restriction also protects the conservation values of that property forever. These conservation values can include public recreation, forest management, water supply and protection, of course, wildlife habitat, trails, etc. The important distinction between a conservation restriction and fee land or reservations is that with conservation restrictions, the landowner who grants the conservation restriction continues to own and manage that land. So all that land on which we hold conservation restrictions, we don't own or manage any of that. That's still privately held or owned by municipalities. So just a visual to explain what a little bit more about what a conservation restriction does. So when you or a municipality owns land, you have the right to use that land many ways. You can play in that land or open that land up to recreation. You can manage that land for water supply or dig wells if it's residential. You can mine that land for oil and gas. You can cut the trees on that land any way that you wish. You can farm that land. And of course, you can develop that land. You can divide that land up into subdivisions. You can develop malls, supermarkets, residential housing, whatever's permitted. A conservation restriction's primary purpose is to eliminate that development potential while still allowing uses that are consistent with preserving those conservation lands. So even though development or most development and most mining is no longer allowed, you can still, in the case of Lynn Woods, have the municipal golf course under the conservation restriction. You can still hold community events and fish and mountain bike and do all the things that you're doing now. The water supply can still be maintained because one of the conservation values of Lynn Woods is to provide a safe drinking water supply for the city of Lynn, and that's an extremely important and increasingly important conservation value that needs to be protected. You can still manage the forests. That too is consistent with maintaining healthy forests as well as maintaining a safe drinking water supply. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of other municipalities that Greenbelt has worked with to preserve their conservation lands. So the first of these is a conservation restriction that the town of West Newbury up on the Merrimack River granted to Greenbelt in 2001. This is a conservation restriction they granted over conservation areas. They call them Pipestave Hill and their Mill Pond conservation area. We hold a conservation restriction over the entire conservation area. This conservation restriction includes active athletic fields. It includes a dock on the pond. It includes equestrian facilities, a horse riding ring, and jumps, and of course trails through the woodlands, and allows skating on the pond, and all the things that everyone was doing on this conservation area before it was permanently preserved. It also happens to be the site of one of Greenbelt's most popular trail runs. And just this last year, the city of Beverly contacted Greenbelt to ask if we would hold a conservation restriction on their Norwood Pond recreation area. So this is a little over 130 acres of land, as you can see, in a pretty fairly densely developed area. And this was not permanently protected, but had been used by the city for at least a couple of decades for passive recreation, trails, horseback riding, running, walking. And the mayor wanted to make sure that given increasing development pressure, this property would always remain protected. And there's a quote at the bottom from the newspaper. When he was asked why he did this, he said, the mayor said, "The zoning is green space, but a future mayor and city council could reverse that zoning and put it back on the rolls to develop. We don't want to see it happen." I also wanted to share with you what I found when researching other cities and towns across Massachusetts who had conservation restrictions on water supply lands. And I was astounded to find that at least 9 cities and towns across the Commonwealth have granted conservation restrictions over significant portions of their water supply lands to ensure that this water supply is permanently preserved. So this is a list of just the ones that I've found. It's not comprehensive, but notable is Fall River, that city has granted a conservation restriction over 4,300 acres of their water supply lands. New Bedford has granted a conservation restriction on over 3,000 acres of their water supply lands. Dalton, over 2,500 acres, and so on. In total, over 16,000 acres in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts has been protected. These are municipally owned lands that have been permanently protected through conservation restrictions that these municipalities have granted to conservation agencies. So my point in sharing this with you is that in considering a conservation restriction for the Lynn Woods Reservation, which includes obviously much of Lynn's, or most of Lynn's significant water supply sources, the city is going down a trail that's been very well blazed by other municipalities in Massachusetts. So in a very small nutshell, that's how Greenbelt can help the city of Lynn permanently preserve Lynn Woods and ensure not only a safe and clean drinking water supply for the future, but ensure that Lynn Woods remains forever available for you, your family, and future generations to enjoy forever. And we're happy to answer any questions you have. I know that was a lot of information.
How do you propose to preserve this land? I didn't hear how you were going to protect it.
So the proposal would be for the city to grant Greenbelt and possibly also DCR a conservation restriction over Lynn Woods. So Lynn Woods would remain owned by the city, and we would hold a conservation restriction over all 2,200 acres that would eliminate the development rights on that property. So the woods could never be further developed for residential or commercial purposes.
I still don't understand how you prevent the city from selling that land off in the future. Do you come in with a legal document and take them to court to prevent that?
That would be the worst case scenario. So the conservation restriction is a legal document that the city will sign, and that will be recorded at the Registry of Deeds, and that is tied to this land forever. And that document spells out what can and cannot happen on the property. And our job as the holder of the conservation restriction is to make sure that all those things that can't happen on the property never do happen. Does that help?
Somewhat. Where do you get your funding for this?
We're a member-supported organization. We also, we've been around for over 50 years, so we're quite well established, and we also have a stewardship endowment for enforcing all of our conservation restrictions. Yeah, in the front.
What about the other 2 cities involved?
Lynn and Saugus, or Lynnfield and Saugus. So they would also, I believe they would also have to be parties to the conservation restriction. They would have to be parties of the conservation restriction as well, because but it would be the city of, they would have to sign the conservation restriction, but it would be the city of Lynn, because Lynn owns the properties in Saugus and Lynnfield that would be granting the conservation restriction. Yeah.
What's the process by which the Greenbelt would have authority as a conservation restriction on this? What happens voting-wise, petition-wise? What is that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what would Greenbelt's authority over Lynn Woods be with a conservation restriction, voting-wise? Is that right?
How do the people, how is it that happens? How does the city of Lynn say to you people, yes, we want the restriction? Is there a vote? Is there a petition? How is that?
Yeah, I understand that there would be a vote of the city council, and the city council and the mayor would ultimately have to sign the conservation restriction. So yes, those will be coming before the city council and the mayor for approval.
You mentioned the DCR being involved. How are they involved?
DCR is helping us right now just to sort of solidify the boundary, to understand what the boundaries are and some of the title work. And it's possible that DCR may co-hold the conservation restriction with us. In front.
As far as, I have a question about that too. And what Steve mentioned in 2005, I think it was the NBC that was going to hold part of the easement that was proposed. And then Mayor Clancy, he didn't want that to happen. He wanted to have more control. And I didn't know that DCR would be involved in this. What's their role in it?
Their role would be primarily just to help us with enforcement if it were ever to come to that. They would be co-holders of the conservation restriction. So we would hold the conservation restriction with DCR.
Now, this is probably a crazy question, but what would happen if Essex Greenbelt, went belly up or whatever? Then who holds that easement at that point?
These are all very good questions. Ed, do you want to answer that?
Sure, it's a great question. So as Vanessa mentioned, we hold over 200 of these, about 6,000 acres. So these are legal instruments, and there's a provision in each of these instruments for an assignment. So if Greenbelt were to not exist as an organization, there's a way in which there would be another holder assigned to the restriction. And also, as Vanessa mentioned, we've been raising money for decades now to make sure we have resources to enforce all of the responsibility we have under these conservation restrictions. And that endowment now is nearly $1 million. So we're well prepared to make sure that these are perpetual, that there's a provision for them and the resources exist to make sure they're protected for generation after generation.
Well, I think it's good that Essex Greenbelt is recognizing sort of the southern Essex County. You can say along with the Household, Spring Pond, Woods, etc. I think it's good as long as Lynn maintains control over the woods.
And in that question, Lynn would maintain control of the woods. So the city would own it, you'd manage it, and so it's actually we call it the belt and suspenders form of conservation. And so you have the best of both worlds, ownership, protection, management at the local level, but now we have another layer of permanent protection under law so that all future generations are going to enjoy it as you have and your kids have.
Go ahead.
I have a question about the DCR involvement. Would they be able to restrict the uses, the recreational uses of the woods, for instance, mountain life?
No.
Are you sure about that?
Well, that would be up to the way the conservation restriction would preserve existing uses of Lynn Woods.
You said that it would have to go through the city council and the mayor. Do you have any kind of feel of whether or not they're in favor of this, or how open they are to this, to Greenbelt coming in?
Mary, do you want to answer that?
Hi, Mary Fountain from Mayor Kennedy's office, and Mayor Kennedy is in full support of this project, this endeavor. But we are asking for your help when it comes to talking to the City Council, the Water and Sewer Board, Park Commission, as well as our local state reps and our State Senator Tom McGee. Thank you.
Themselves. Why can't they file for a Conservation Act direct instead of getting another layer of management involved?
Because you can't hold it on property that you own.
They have to go through somebody else? So we've had 130 plus years
Right.
of no issues.
Right.
Is there a pending issue ahead that is needing to happen?
No, issues have come up in the past, and we don't want to hold it and then be able to turn it over. It's the same as our zoning that can be turned over by ourselves as well.
So we're trying to get a conservation that protects us from ourselves.
That's correct, and other cities and other developers. Yeah.
All right, is there anybody else other than Greenbelt as a candidate?
Not at this time, besides the DCR.
Okay.
Can I ask if Linfield and Saugus, if any work council, those cities are also on the same page, or
That might be a question for Dan.
Could you repeat that question?
Yeah, he was asking how Saugus and Linfield are going to feel about this. Now, no one's heard anything officially on this. I suspect that Saugus has no reason to care because it doesn't really affect them. If you look at the land that Lynn owns in Saugus, it isn't anything they can do anything with anyhow. You're talking about Birch Pond, you're talking about the land behind Birch Pond, which is all landlocked now. And some of that is actually already Saugus conservation land, and a lot of it's owned by the DCR. They bought it back in 2001 when we tried to do this the first time. They own a lot of that land back there, so that's tied up anyhow. Saugus really has no stake in it. Linfield is going to be the one that would be more of a challenge because the land in Linfield that is constantly, like the example I gave with the land swap in 2005, there's road frontage on Route 1. That land is worth a lot of money, and that might be more of an issue. But we'll just have to cross those bridges when we get to them. That land is also, as I said when I was speaking earlier, that's sitting right on the headwaters of our water supply. Lynn owns that for a reason. That wasn't a random event they bought that. It wasn't an investment property. It was bought because it's on Hawks Brook. And if you go out there and look at it, take a map, go look at the site, you'll understand what was going on there, why we own the land we own Linfield. Yeah.
Will this land be resurveyed so that it has its boundaries?
I believe that's the work that the DCR is working on now. Is that correct? Yeah, that's that and the title search.
The survey that was done is actually a very good survey. It was just never formally recorded. So we're hoping to work with the city to actually get that survey recorded so it's official in all the records.
This is the one that was performed in the master plan back in 2000?
Yes, yeah, the Boston Survey Consult BSC plan, yeah.
Yes. Once the conservation restriction is implemented, are there any circumstances, due to the fact that the city will still retain ownership of the land, are there any circumstances under which that conservation restriction can be nullified or removed or voided?
You guys are asking tough questions. They're good ones, though. Ideally, no. However, if there were, this is what we say back at the office, if there's an apocalypse and the federal government starts taking land, that remains untested. But as far as we are aware, no conservation restriction in the country has been overturned by for those purposes.
Not the federal government, but the city itself.
I don't believe so.
Are you sure?
This is why I'm not a lawyer. I'm never sure. No, a conservation restriction is one of the strongest protections you can have in place. I mean, this is a document that's recognized at the federal level as well as at the state level, legislatively, and it is as ironclad, legally ironclad as you can get. And there have been conservation restrictions threatened throughout the country, and those threats have gone away because they haven't been able to succeed.
So once implemented, it would be more of a buffer of sorts rather than permanent protection?
No, it's a means of permanent protection. It's not a buffer. It would specify what cannot ever happen on Lynn Woods. It would specify that Lynn Woods can never be developed. I take that back. No, as I also stated, a conservation restriction is the strongest protection mechanism that you can have in place for a piece of land in this country. And to my knowledge, not one has been overturned in the country, ever.
And just to reiterate, Essex County Greenbelt has been doing this for 50 years.
That's correct, over 50 years.
I think we're okay.
And we plan to be around a lot longer. Ed, do you want to add anything to that?
Hi, I'm Joan LeBlanc from the Saugus River Watershed Council. See a lot of great friends here. I want to thank Dan, Vanessa, Steve, and everyone who so diligently worked on this. Our view on this proposal is that it's a fabulous opportunity. I think we all saw in the movie and we know firsthand that Lynn Woods is a tremendous treasure. And I myself was surprised to learn a few years ago that it was not permanently protected. And when we learned that is when it came under siege with various development proposals. Because a lot of us assume if something is called a park or a reservation that it is protected. And that was not the case in terms of all of the beautiful acres here. So Essex County Greenbelt is a very reputable organization. We have had conversations with them trying to entice them to come into the watershed and help us protect various pieces of land that have seemed at risk. So I just want to add to the discussion here that it's a great opportunity. A lot of communities might have a local land trust organization that would serve this function of putting in a conservation restriction when you have an important piece of land. Lynn doesn't have that, so Essex County Greenbelt can provide that service, and I think it's a great opportunity. It would be a fabulous partnership, and it really is just a layer of protection. That's the only change. There's no change as far as recreational opportunities. From the watershed ecosystem perspective, this would be fabulous. I mean, as you all know, Lynn Woods abuts the reservoir system, which is fed primarily by the Saugus River, and to a smaller extent by the Ipswich River. It's a very important area from an ecological perspective, and one that is under threat right now, or could be in the future. We don't want to have to worry about who's in office to decide whether or not this is protected forever. And by getting this conservation restriction in place, we wouldn't have that worry anymore. So thanks so much for coming here tonight and all the work that you've done. We look forward to working with you.
One more question.
One more question. If the federal government decides to extend 95 through the park, like they tried to do before, are you going to stop them?
Yes. I think they want to wrap up, but I'm happy to stay afterwards and answer questions without a microphone.
Vanessa, too. On the bottom of the agenda you came in, there was her contact information, my contact information. If you have any questions later on, you can always relate them to us and we'll answer them for you.
Did you hear that? On the bottom of the agenda is my contact information and Dan's contact information, email and phone. If you have any additional questions, comments, concerns, feel free to contact us.